They said we'd be getting this patch late February, and boy did they wait till late February. But we finally have the patch notes for version 2.3, and unlike all my previous times with these videos where I go on for quite a bit about every change that's made, I actually want to keep it a little bit shorter this time so it's not long and doesn't go on for 10 to 15 minutes like the previous ones have. So I'm going to keep things a bit short this time and get straight to the point when it comes to the changes that these weapons and stuff have received. So with that said, let's get started. Before we really get into this, I want to just point out right away that this is going to be primarily buffs. They in fact didn't really nerf anything this patch, so if you're expecting Stingray or Splashdown nerfs or anything like that, you're not going to get that here, unfortunately. The first up is the arrow spray, in which they increase the painting ability of the bullets that come out of the gun. This was actually nerfed a bit back when Baller used to be very prevalent, as the arrow spray RG was very capable of outputting Ballers pretty fast per match, and in version 1.3 Baller had a lot of health and not a lot of weapons could break it fast. So they're sort of reverting back to this state where now, because Baller is easy to break, they're giving its coverage back. Here's one I'm excited about. They actually are reducing the RNG or deviation for the 52 gal. The deviation on the first shot is significantly less than it used to be, and now following shots will have less deviation than they did before, which if you don't know, that basically just means that it's going to be a bit more accurate than it used to be, which is really nice as it already kind of suffers from a lot of deviation. The Jet Squelcher will have its deviation when mid-air and when jumping reduced by 20%. If you're unaware, when you jump and fire in this game, you actually are less accurate than if you just stand on the ground. It creates deviation, which means that the shots will go farther away from the reticle, and this sort of fix is addressing the Jet Squelcher's deviation when in the air. They increase the speed of the initial shots out of a Clash Blaster, however they reduce the painting ability of the weapon itself. This may seem a little odd, but in fact the Clash Blaster is quite annoying when it comes to its ability to just poke damage, and they sort of made a decent change by making it to where it can fire a little bit faster, but reducing the paint coverage that it has. The L3 Nozzle Nose gets its shot velocity buffed by 25%, which basically just means that the shots travel faster than they did before and increase that by 25%. I can't say for sure how big of an effect this is going to have. I don't really use L3 that much anymore as I used to, so I can't say if this is going to be something that's going to be very noticeable. However, usual increases in shot velocity do become pretty apparent, and it was actually very apparent when the velocity of the Splattershot Pro's bullets was increased a bit back. The H3 Nozzle Nose had its deviation in air reduced as well. This is a weapon that actually in the first game didn't really have any deviation when in air. It was still very accurate when you were jumping, and then between games they decided to give it some deviation for some odd reason. In fact, a lot of weapons that were used more commonly towards the end of Splatoon 1 got some pretty interesting changes between games, and the Cherry H3 in the first game was starting to become very prevalent, so I imagine a lot of the changes made to it were to reflect that, and which is really unfair. Another thing for the H3 is it also has better coverage. The Carbon Roller actually gets buffed, and this is something that I feel has been very neglected. This weapon needed to be buffed several times at this point, but they haven't really done it. They increased the horizontal kill range by 35%. So basically the lethal range of the Carbon Roller has been extended slightly, and this is something that's sort of needed. This was sort of needed as back in Splatoon 1 the Carbon Roller could chase down people using burst bombs, and that's how it would close the gap between players. Now that it doesn't have that, once it gets in on people, and if it just so happens to not get the kill, then it's sort of just screwed, and all the effort that requires going in and getting that close to people has all gone to waste. So giving it a bit more of a kill potential does help this weapon a lot. The E-Liter also gets a buff. They actually increase the shot velocity of a full charge by 50%. So basically, much like the other velocity changes, it just goes faster when it's fired. This only affects the fully charged shots, so when an E-Liter is fully charged, when it lets go of the trigger, the ink is going to travel much faster than it used to, making it easier to, connect to the people that you were already pointing at. While I'm not the biggest user of E-Liter, I do think that it still needs some more changes, as right now it really does lose out to Splatterscope or the Splat Charger in just about every way, so Nintendo needs to be making a little bit more changes. As for what changes, I would think personally, I can't really tell you, as again, not really someone that uses it, but it's definitely an unfortunate weapon that sort of sits in a very bad state where they're just being neglected because of how strong it was. Much like when I said with the H3, I feel like this is one of the weapons that sort of got a hard hit because of how it was treated in the first game and how common it was, which is unfortunate and not really needed at all. This is a buff that I'm honestly confused by, and they reduced the recovery lag on the mini splatling by 10 frames. Recovery lag being that point where you can't recover your own ink, often described as white ink by other people. It's that little white spot in your tank when you use, certain weapons or use a sub and you have to wait for that white ink to go away. That's basically recovery lag. And they reduced the mini splatling's recovery lag after firing by 10 frames. I don't quite understand this, nor do I think this would really come up as someone that has played mini a lot. I can't even really say that this has come up, not having the ability to recover ink faster. So I don't quite understand this change. The Hydra splatling gets to fire 25% longer. For those that actually don't know, and this is actually not very common information, between games the Hydra splatling actually got hit with a slight nerf in that it takes a little bit longer to charge and would fire a little bit less than it used to back in Splatoon 1. So now it seems like they're either reverting it back to what it was in Splatoon 1 or giving it more than what it had before, which in my opinion right now is kind of fine, as the Hydra splatling is in a sort of not good state where the game has a lot more displacement now than it used to in Splatoon 1. So the Hydra can't really sit still as long as it would have in the first game. So it needed a few more changes to keep it in the game, and having it fire a bit longer would bring more value to having it charge and outputting that ink. The Dually Squelchers has its natural deviation without rolling reduced by 20%. So basically when you're in the normal stance with the Dually Squelchers, they'll have reduced deviation, and this is something that actually sort of suffers from a fair amount of RNG when it comes to firing. Much like all the other dualies, the Dually Squelchers kind of suffers a little bit more as it's a long-range weapon, so it has more travel time. So the RNG is actually going to hurt this a lot more than the like the mid-range dualies, like the the Splat dualies. So this is a good change. And then the weapon I wanted them to buff, then they buffed, and it's irrelevant. The Undercover Brella gets a buff, but it's nothing anyone wanted. In fact, they just buffed what it's really good at, and that's painting, and they increased its coverage. I can't even begin to understand why they would buff something it's already good at, and not any of the things it has problems with. But, shoutouts to Nintendo, whatever. Then on to the only sub-weapon change, and that is the Squid Beacon, which now, if you are near an enemy Squid Beacon on the map, you will be revealed to them. This is actually helpful for if you're jumping to a beacon and there happens to be an enemy closing in on it and you didn't know, and then they break it and then your jump is revealed. Now, if you look at the map and there's an enemy near your beacon, they will be revealed to you. This may not seem like a big deal, and it might not really be, but this is a really good change and very interesting to see what could come of this. Like, I'm very interested to see how close you would have to be, as then it would kind of give a little bit value to very strategically placed beacons that could be used to sort of watch entry points, depending, again, how close they have to be. Then, for specials, we have only 3 changes. The Tenna missiles will now have the ability to swim while you use them. This is a very similar change to what Stingray got between the test fire and the final game. In the test fire, you actually couldn't swim if you had your Stingray out. Then they gave you the ability to swim with it. Now you'll be able to swim around with Tenna missiles before firing them. And then these next 2 are basically the same buff, so I'm just going to group them together. But Baller and Inkjet will have better mobility and better turning. For Baller, this is understandable, as it's actually pretty difficult for a Baller to like 180 and turn around and go and chase down people or something. Inkjet, it's a little bit because it can still turn very well, but this does give Inkjet a bit of a buff that's kind of needed. But that's pretty much all the important stuff. There wasn't really any nerfs. There were a few changes made to special requirements. If you're curious about that, I'll link them in the description below. And I'll also link the Japanese patch notes. Assuming that the English ones are out by the time this video goes up, I'll link them as well. In fact, I'll probably still link the page that is used for the English patch notes if you're curious, and you can go bookmark that or check that when this goes up. But yeah, that's pretty much it. It's just a bunch of buffs. And one thing that is important to note is, unlike all previous patches, they didn't announce when the next one was going to be. Usually after they release patch notes, they say when the next patch is going to be, or give like a rough estimate of when it's going to be. They just didn't this time, so we have no idea if we're going to be getting one next month, or if we get one in 2 months or whatever. So we'll have to wait and see what happens. I'd like to hear everyone else's thoughts on these patch notes, and I want to thank everyone for watching, and I will see you all next time.